Many people today find it difficult to reconcile the Bible and science. Unfortunately, there has been little help in this matter. This is why I was forced to find answers for myself. Fortunately, I had some study of Greek and Hebrew in my past, and I had taken a class in Greek discourse analysis from the Wycliffe Bible translators. The purpose of my channel is to disseminate what I have discovered. My book, New Evidence for Two Human Origins, Discoveries that Reconcile the Bible and Science, latest edition, 2015, contains my findings. One of my discoveries concerning the Hebrew and Greek language was my discovery that the Hebrew language uses their conjunction to indicate to the reader if words such as these or this refers to what was written before or what was written after. I have a YouTube video on this subject entitled "A Discovery in Hebrew Language Reveals a Dual Human Origin." One should really view this video before viewing this one. You can click on it at the end of this video. This video is to explain that the Hebrew conjunction, wow, was used to move a narrative forward. The inclusion of this conjunction in Genesis 2:5 indicates that the narrative is moving on to a later time and a new subject matter. Genesis 2 is not a repetition of Genesis 1, but there is more to it than this. I will go over a few pages of my book for you here. Also, I have a blog, garytmayer.blogspot.com. This current video is more technical and difficult than any of my other videos. Scriptures are from the New American Standard Bible. I will show that Genesis 2 verse 5 and what follows are set at a time after the creation of Genesis 1. Remembering the examples we have read that illustrate the use of the Hebrew conjunction wow, and moving on to further understand the Hebrew narrative, we shall look at examples that will indicate why we should conclude that Genesis 2:5 begins a new creation subsequent to that of Genesis 1. We shall discover that in the vast majority of the time, each sentence of a narrative begins with the conjunction wow. If it does not, there is almost always a discernible reason. If a narrative clause begins with a conjunction, the reader is to assume that the narrative moves on in time unless, number one, the following event is specifically stated to have occurred at some other time, at a time earlier in the story, or at a time further into the future. Number two, there is sufficient information found within a short span of the local text that indicates that something other than a smooth glide into the future is to be understood by the reader. Or, number three, the conjunction is only functioning as a connective for non-time related items. The narrative may inform the reader when the next event has taken place or will take place. Now let us look at a passage in which the author explicitly informs the reader when the event in question took place. The NASB translates the wow conjunction with the word now. Here are the opening two verses of Genesis 6, 1 through 8. Now, literally, and it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and the daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomsoever they chose. Genesis 5 follows the genealogy of Noah. The sons of the god, fallen angels, began to marry the daughters of men near the beginning of this time. The formula, "and it came about," overrides the general rule that states that a narrative moves along into the near future when it is preceded with the conjunction wow. The formula, "and it came about," specifies to the reader when this section is again taking up the narrative account. In this instance, the author began his account of Genesis 6 at a time that would place it approximately at the first half of chapter 5. To make this plain, he states at what time the angelic human marriages began to occur. It was when the descendants of Adam and Eve began to multiply. The author is not moving on from the end of the genealogies of Genesis 5, but he also is not going back to repeat what he has already written. I must warn you that this Hebrew formula is not always translated with the words "and it came about," as the NASB translates it. Other translations may vary from this. The Hebrew of the expression may be "and it came about when," or "and it came about as." Next, we shall look at another passage in which we are explicitly told the time of the narrated event, because it did not follow chronologically the last events. At first glance, one might think that this rule breaks down at Genesis 11 because chapter 11 opens with a conjunction, and the episode described in Genesis 11 appears to precede the scattering of the people as recorded in Genesis 10. Genesis 11 opens with the words, "Now," literally, "and the whole earth used the same language and the same words. And it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar." Genesis 11, 1 through 2, emphasis mine. Please note that the setting of Genesis 11 is specified in the second clause. Usually the formula that sets the narrative's time is given in the first clause of a paragraph, but here it appears in the next clause. This was no doubt done to state the theme of the next section with no distraction, because the next section deals with the confounding of their language. The author is using this formula, "and it came about as," to specify the point in his narrative at which he now resumes his narrative. This formula takes us back to the founding of the settlement at Babel. It resumes the narrative back in time when they were leaving the ark to journey to the territory of Babel. Therefore, the author employs a formula, writing, "and it came about as they journeyed east." The author of Genesis believes the reader will understand that his new section begins when they were just arriving at Babel. We may assume this because "they" includes all of them. They never traveled altogether eastward in the land of Shinar after their scattering from Babel, so as one reads this sentence he knows when this was happening, because the author expressly indicates the point in time that he now resumes the narrative, the presence of the conjunction does not indicate that the narrative is moving on from the time of their scattering from Babel. I will now skip over the next paragraph in my book, which explains why Moses placed the conjunction at the beginning of Genesis 11, verse 2. How should Genesis 2:5 be understood? It is important that we notice that this passage provides an alternative way that Moses could have written Genesis 2:5, the verse that introduces the creation of Adam and Eve. As has been shown, if no conjunction is included before the clause containing the these formula, and no conjunction is included after this clause, then the formula refers to the material that follows it. Case 2. Therefore, it was necessary for Moses to begin his narrative of the Garden of Eden and the creation of Adam and Eve, Genesis 2:5, with the conjunction. Otherwise, the clause, these are the generations, better translated descendants, of the heavens and the earth, Genesis 2:4, would have been referring to what follows it rather than to Genesis 1. As Genesis 11 verse 2 begins with the formula, and it came about when, to indicate that he had now reverted back in his narrative to the time at which the sons of Noah were journeying to Babel. So Moses could have used this formula to indicate when Adam and Eve were created. He could have written, and it came about on the 6th day of creation that, quote, no shrub of the field was yet in the earth. Or he could have written, and it came about after God had created the animals that no shrub of the field was yet in the earth. However, he did neither of these. He began Genesis 2:5 with the Hebrew prefix conjunction, with no indication that his narrative was not moving forward in time. It is the absence of any indication that the narrative is not progressing forward in time, coupled with the presence of the conjunction, that indicates to us that Genesis 2 relates a subsequent, different creation from Genesis 1. This may be why interpreters of this text have failed to see that the narrative moves on to a different creation story in Genesis 2. This has been a long video, but I saw no other way to explain this discovery concerning the Hebrew language. My point was that an ancient Hebrew reader of Genesis 1 and 2 would have known by Moses' employment of the Hebrew conjunction that the creation account of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 was of a different and subsequent creation account from Genesis 1. This means that God created the people of Genesis 1 by descent in Adam and Eve, later by direct creation from the ground. Therefore, a theistic evolutionary view of creation does not contradict the Bible. Thanks for listening.